This is Treasure Island by Robert Louis Stevenson, published by the Conversation Tree Press in 2024 in a limitation of 346 copies across 3 states, standard, deluxe and lettered, as well as an additional 10 copies in sheets for those who wanted to bind it themselves. The proprietor of the press, Tony Gear, was kind enough to lend me copies of all 3 states, and so we'll be able to take a look at them all here, starting with this one, which is a copy of the standard state. The book comes in a slipcase which is bound in this Italian linen cloth. It has a fairly coarse texture which makes it feel nice and tactile. One really feels that this is a cloth bound slipcase. It feels reasonably well made, and the inside is lined with a brown suede-like material, so it's nice and soft and safe in there for the book. Otherwise, nothing too remarkable about that slipcase. Then we come on to the edition itself. It is bound in that same Italian linen cloth, quarter bound I should say, and that is over these sides which are covered in this paper that we see here. So this is the 4th book from the Conversation Tree Press, the 4th that I've reviewed, and I have to say that every edition so far has somewhere found a use for a really attractive paper, and this edition is no exception. I really like this paper. I think the way the gold here catches the light is quite spectacular, and then we have these swirly motions which are obviously quite evocative of the sea, which plays quite a big role in the novel. So another really nice paper choice for this edition. Flipping over to the spine, we see that it's blocked in gilt with the title Treasure Island. Here we have RLS, which are the initials of the author Robert Louis Stevenson, and MC, the initials of this edition's illustrator Mark Castelli. If we turn to the top edge, we see that the top edge of the book is trimmed. We have this ribbon marker in quite a fetching yellow colour. We see basically the same thing on the bottom of the book, and the foredge as well is trimmed. Opening the book, we first encounter end papers which are plain brown, and then we come to the paper of the book proper, which in this standard state is 120 GSM Munken paper. This is a thoroughly modern paper. It has a really quite smooth surface and has good opacity. To me, for a book of this size, 120 GSM is almost the perfect weight. Enough substance about it to not feel fragile in such large sheets, but at the same time not so thick and heavy to feel a bit artificial or unwieldy. Now if we turn into the book proper, we get our first look at some features of the typographic plan in this standard state. So firstly, we see that the main text here is going to be set in a face called Bembo Book. That is a modern digital incarnation of a classic face, Bembo, which is very widely used in the private press world, and for good reason. That's a very legible face. And then we also see that we have these display elements which are set in a face called Gaudi, and this is a suitably piratical black letter face, which I think is thematically quite relevant for the book. I should say that all states of the book share exactly the same substantive contents, so they have the same typographic layout, the same combination of Gaudi and Bembo, and all of them were printed letterpress at Nomad Letterpress, so the quality of the printing is going to be very good indeed. Now turning on one page further, we arrive at the title spread, and so here we see the only thing in the book that is not going to be printed in black is the title. It's printed in blue in that Gaudi face again. And the other thing we see staring right at us is the frontispiece, which is the first of Mark Castelli's illustrations, and this gives us a good idea of what to expect from the rest of those. So these are pen and ink illustrations that were then transferred to blocks, as I said, to be printed letterpress. We see the style here makes heavy use of this hatched shading, which I think gives the images a certain roughness, which is quite thematically appropriate, I think, for the book. And we have a nice rendition here of the Hispaniola out on the seas on its way, no doubt, to Treasure Island. Here on the title page we see, as I mentioned, that this is a book illustrated by Mark Castelli, and we also see that we're going to have an introduction by Carolyn Howitt. Arriving at that introduction, we get another hint at the typographic plan for this book, and one of the standout features of it is that it's printed in 2 columns. That's a relatively unconventional choice for a modern book, but I think an intelligent one given the other attributes of this book. This book has a fairly large trim size, it's essentially folio sized, and that means we have a big page to fill. And if we were to have a single column, that would give us very long lines indeed, which would compromise readability. So the alternative to having these 2 columns would be to print in a much larger face, which would then make the whole book a lot thicker and more expensive and heavier and more unwieldy. Or alternatively, of course, we could shrink the size of the page, but then the volume would be a little bit less impressive. So I think the 2 column solution here is a smart one. And the typography of the introduction is a template of what follows for the rest of the book. So if I just flip through to pages from the book, we see here we have, again, these chapter headers in Gaudi, 2 column printing with Mark Castelli's illustrations embedded throughout. The only times that we depart from that 2 column layout are, firstly, as here, when quoting from letters and other such things, we have a single column. And then interestingly, we have a spread here, which is printed in 3 columns, but in a portrait orientation. And I presume that was done to make way for these panoramic images that span across the 3 columns. So that's quite an interesting thing to encounter in the book. One other typographic thing to remark on is that each of the parts of the book starts with this illustration, again by Castelli, as a title to the part. And then when we arrive at the beginning of the part proper, each part has its own hand-drawn initial to open the first chapter of that part. And here we can see that yellow ribbon marker. I find the colour quite fetching, in fact. So as I said, the substantive contents of the 3 states are all the same. So now we'll take a look more closely at some of Mark Castelli's illustrations in this standard state before pressing on to look at the deluxe and lettered states. Here is a map of Treasure Island. It is drawn by Castelli specifically for this edition, so we don't get Stevenson's original map in this case. I think the map fits with the style of the illustrations in the rest of the book. One thing I was a little bit surprised by is to find this map labelled Skeleton Island. My interpretation of the text is that Skeleton Island is just this little islet here off the coast of the rest of the island, but altogether a nicely constructed map. Some of the illustrations as here are presented as vignettes which are integrated in the text. Other times we have these larger full-page illustrations or half-page illustrations. And there are 52 of those illustrations in total, so this is a very generously illustrated edition indeed. And as you see, as I flip through here, I'm not being particularly selective about which page I turn to, and it's not so very often that I arrive at a 2-page spread which does not have at least 1 illustration on it. So really a profoundly illustrated book. Now we arrive at a couple of spreads I think are quite interesting. So here we have 2 antagonists, without giving too much away, facing off against each other, and that's represented quite nicely in this visual way. And then here atop each column we have these 4 illustrations which nicely show the events of the story unfolding. Same repeated here. we reach the conclusion of the book, and then at the end of the book we have a few essays written by Stevenson. So they're a nice additional inclusion. One last thing to say about this standard state is that we have here, of course, the colophon page. It is signed by the illustrator Mark Castelli, and these standard states are not numbered. So that is the standard state of Treasure Island. Now let's move on to take a look at the deluxe state. So here is the deluxe state. Again, we get a slipcase. This time it is bound in a brown linen cloth, and if I allow it to catch the light, perhaps you can see that it has this two-tone effect with both a lighter and a darker shade of brown, so that's quite effective. The other thing we see here is that we have this cutout which somewhat enigmatically just shows a patch of leather beneath. More on that in just a moment. One thing that you can't see is that this is now a substantially heavier volume, like really quite heavy. I feel it in my arms just holding it here, and we'll see what's going on with that as well in just a moment's time. So I will put the book aside just to finish with the slipcase. Here's that cutout. It feels, again, well made, a little bit more substantial than the slipcase from the standard state. And again, it is lined with a brown suede-like material. So here is the deluxe state of the book itself. And now we see where that weight was coming from, because this is a book that is bound in solid oak boards. They're about 10 millimeters or a little bit under ½ an inch thick. And they have this antiqued finish, I suppose, to represent an old sea chest, like the one that features very prominently in the book. It's a very nice effect, and I think this book would make a nice display piece standing looking out from your shelf. We also see what that patch of black leather was, because here we have inset into the board this round leather disc, which represents the black spot, which is an important plot element from the book. The deluxe state is quarter bound now in black leather, and if we flip over to the spine, we see, just like the standard state, that is blocked in gilt with the title and the initials of the author and illustrator, and we also now have these 6 raised bands on the spine. The top edge of the text block is now gilded, and we have now red end bands and a red ribbon marker. As before, the bottom and foredges are trimmed, and there you can see just how heavy duty those wooden boards are. One last thing to say, if I let this catch the light, is you can probably see that these boards have been hand distressed a little bit. Looks like somebody hit them with a hammer or something. Now, if I open that book, again, I feel immediately the weight of that wooden board. It doesn't feel like opening a book with a cardboard cover. And then we have the end papers, which use that same paper stock that we saw on the front boards of the standard state, which is really nice because, as I said, that's a nice paper, and it's great that readers of the deluxe state get to enjoy that too. Then we get those brown end papers, and then we come on to the paper of the edition itself. This time the paper is 135 GSM Naturalis paper. This paper is even smoother than the one that we saw in the standard state, so it feels like a very refined paper indeed. I think it's a matter of personal taste which of those two papers you will prefer, and to me neither one is inherently superior than the other. And as I mentioned already, the substantive contents of this deluxe state are identical to those in the standard state. So we have exactly the same typographic layout, the same illustrations, the same use of colour on the title page, and so on. One place where the two books do differ is if we turn to the colophon page. These deluxe states are now going to be hand numbered as well as signed by the illustrator. So that is a tour of the deluxe state. Now let's finish up by taking a look at the lettered state. Okay, so what we have here, ladies and gentlemen, is a bona fide oaken sea chest. It is emblazoned on the top with this black bee which no doubt stands for Billy Bones, and this is intended to represent Billy Bones's sea chest, which plays an important role in the first act of the book. As I mentioned, it's made from oak. Again, it has this antique finish, so it looks somewhat convincingly like it may be an old sea chest that a sailor has been dragging around behind him for some years. The one exception to that is the base of the box, which uses oak veneer rather than solid oak, but the rest is indeed solid oak. If I flip the box around, which is tough because this thing weighs about 10 kilograms, we see on the side we have these antique brass handles, the same on the other side too, and we also have some feet here which run the length of the box and ensure that the box stands elevated from whatever surface you put it on. I think it goes without saying that this is a box that will need to be stored flat on a surface, so it's not something you can stand up next to your other books on a bookshelf, but in return for that you get a really quite impressive display piece. So the lid opens like so. If I just pull it forward a moment, you can see that inside we have this padded section which is lined with this suede material to help protect the book, and then we have the book proper inside. So we have this brown ribbon pull which we can use to lift the book out. So I will take that out of the box for just a moment. We see inside again it has this cutout compartment for the book. Again, it's lined with suede and it feels ever so slightly padded, so the book is really going to be safe in there, probably from a nuclear bomb, given that you have this wooden box for it to live in. So let me put the box aside and then we'll take a look at the book itself. So it arrives in this plastic bag, and inside we have the book, of course, but first I should show you that we also get these two printed broadsides. They feature illustrations by Mark Castelli. So here is that map again. Here is another illustration of the Hispaniola. This one features also some text from the book. These are printed on a very heavy indeed paper. It feels like an all rag paper. Absolutely luxurious paper for these broadsides, so they're very nice to handle. A nice little addition there to the book. But of course the thing everybody's waiting for is for me to get out the volume itself, so let me do that. So the book is bound in leather. It feels like a quite luxurious leather, I have to say. We have this dark blue leather base, which of course represents the sea, and then onlaid onto that we have progressively lighter shades of blue tracing out a topographic map of the island. Also, if I let this catch the light, you can see embossed into the leather and more contour lines to give that topographic effect. If I rotate the book around, we see we have a similar design extending onto the back, and now the spine is unadorned. It just has that design to it. This reminds me a lot of these designer bindings that people often commission. It looks like a really nice high-end binding, so very nice indeed. I should say, by the way, that both this lettered state and also the deluxe state that we looked at a moment ago were bound by Ludlow bookbinders, and they've done a great job on both states. The top edge is gilded again. Now we have a blue ribbon marker, and on this state the end bands are now hand sewn, so that's another nice touch. If we open the book, we're confronted with end papers that are unique to this lettered state. They were hand marbled by Freya Scott, and very nice they are indeed. Another change for this lettered state is that we now have 170 GSM Liber Charta paper. We've seen this paper a couple of times before on the channel, and I've said before that it's been billed as a successor to the perennially popular Zircol paper, which is now defunct since the Zircol mill shut down. So I think everybody's on the hunt for a replacement for that paper, and this Liber Charta seems to be one of the front runners. It's a little bit hard for me to draw a direct comparison to Zircol because there are many different types of Zircol, many different colours, many different textures and weights, but this is certainly a nice paper. Again, it's a fairly smooth stock. I think the smooth stock makes it easier to print these long form works, letterpress, and the weight of course means that we have excellent opacity again here. Otherwise, just as in the other two states, the substantive contents here are going to be identical. I think it's to Conversation Tree's credit that they don't dilute the contents of the lower states just to try and sell more of the expensive ones. Just like the deluxe state, the one point where the contents of this lettered book do differ is on the colophon page, where now not only is this numbered, but it's signed by the illustrator, the printers, and the binder at Ludlow, who was responsible for creating this binding. And well, they should sign it because it's a bit of a work of art. So that is Treasure Island by Robert Louis Stevenson, published by the Conversation Tree Press in its 2024 limited edition. Another really nice edition from Conversation Tree Press. Let me comment briefly on the three states. So firstly, we have this standard state, which, as with earlier Conversation Tree books, I think represents excellent value for money. So you're getting a bona fide fine press book, fully letterpress printed. It feels very nicely made. Lots of tasteful design choices, including most spectacularly this paper, which I really enjoyed, and those generous 52 illustrations by Mark Costelli. So lots to like about this book, and I think at a very competitive price point. The other thing I should say is that this standard state is the lightest of the three states. And so if you're looking for a copy that you can hold and very comfortably use as a reading copy, this would be a good choice. The deluxe state is at the other end of the scale. This is by far the heaviest of the three states. And it's a little bit heavy to hold comfortably in one's hands, so I wouldn't want to read it that way. I did try reading it in my lap and that was fine. Of course, reading it on a tabletop is also fine. But the main standout feature of this deluxe state is that it just looks like a lot of fun. It has these wooden boards, it has the black spot, and I think standing this up as a display piece on a bookcase would really be quite attractive. Again, it feels very well made. Of course, the boards make it solid, but the leather binding here also feels well put together. We still have that attractive paper here on the end leaves. So altogether, again, much to like about this deluxe state. Lastly, we have the lettered state. I mean, it feels like a work of art. This really not only feels like a premium binding by Ludlow, but it looks like a privately commissioned designer binding. We have, again, those attractive end papers by Freya Scott. So this is really just a very nice book indeed. To mention the almost literal elephant in the room, if you do buy the lettered state, then you've got to find a place for this sea chest. But in return, you get something that I think is a lot of fun. And at the end of the day, I think Treasure Island is nothing if not a fun book. And so that's really a nice addition that feels, again, very authentic and well made, and a real highlight of that lettered state. So altogether, again, another great edition from Conversation Tree Press that was really a lot of fun to look at.